Hello and welcome to this video. This video is the first video in a series about AL developers we need to do better. We're going to take a look at just what is going on in our world and what we have to adapt. Well, let's get started. In our community or in any other development community, you really have two kinds of developers. You've got the cowboys, where everything has to go fast and everything has to be done as easily as possible. However, we're not really keeping in mind the stability of our code. We're not really thinking that much about the testability or the readability. On the other hand, we got the perfectionists. The perfectionists are the ones that will always keep 100% to all the guidelines. Everything has to be testable. Everything has to be written in the same perfect way as everything around us. We have to use best practices. Now, I'm not necessarily saying one is better than the other, because in the ideal world, both of these will work together, and most developers will also be somewhere in between these two. However, in Business Central, we do have a problem because we're seeing more cowboys in our community than you see in any other development communities. Now, one of the main reasons behind this is because many of the developers we have in our communities are not really developers by heart. They have been taught all the best practices. They're still taught. Normally, they are consultants that become programmers. We also have this whole hybrid thing going. Now, you don't see this in another community. Normally in other communities, developers are developers and consultants are consultants. And developers are something that comes from development background, university or whatever. And the consultants are also from another field. Now this has been a strength in our community because it has always been great to have a consultant that can do both the development and the consulting at the same time. The customers was happy. However, we are now in a place where everything is getting more complicated. And on top of that, we are needing more people. So how we normally recruit more people is that we hire someone, hopefully someone with a background in programming, sit them next to a mentor who will tell them everything they need to know about how to develop in Business Central. And that's great, as long as they don't also teach them all their bad habits. And that's the problem we're going to try to look at in this video series. One of the things that has been very difficult for new developers when they come to Business Central, or in the old days NAV, was the fact that they came right out of school, many of them, with all these great ideas on how everything is done using best practices. However, they are always met with this wall saying, yeah, that's fine. This is how you're supposed to do it, but we're not going to do it like that because the customer doesn't want to pay for it. And that is a problem. We should always strive to make the best solutions. Now I know, of course, there is always the element of if something is worth it or not worth it. And that's something people have to think about every time they write a task or do some kind of development or any other thing, if the effort is actually worth the output. Now on to the topic of the video itself. We're living in a world where anyone can extend the Business Central functionality. And it's free, and even the customers can do it themselves, or a customer can have a nephew or whatever who can also extend. And that's always great because that means that a lot of people can get into our community without having much problems that way. However, that also means that they can start extending your extensions. So what we have to start doing is we have to think about when we write our code, if it can be extended, someone is going to extend it. Now you might be thinking, but my customer is never going to extend anything in their Business Central. But you have to think of what if. What if the customer starts saying, hey, I can do my own development, it's free. And then they start extending upon your extension, of course, through dependencies. That's where we're going to have to start thinking about if something in our code is extendable, someone is going to extend it. So how are we going to solve this problem? Well, there are two methods. The first method is, of course, we can close everything down, make everything private, make everything internal, and then no one can ever use our code. And of course, this method is an easy way of doing it, but it's also kind of against the whole idea of making everything easy to integrate with. So that's not what we're going to do. The second method, which of course is what we're going to look at here, is to make sure that everything has a correct way of integrating, to make sure that when someone actually starts calling our code, we know what's going to happen. So the first thing we're going to look at is enums, because with the introduction of enums, we are facing a different problem that we weren't used to. Because back in the time we had options, and any developer could add an option to the option string if they wanted to, and it was their responsibility to make sure that if they added something, they did not break something else. Now, if you make an enum, you can make it extensible. But if you make it extensible, you also have to make sure that if someone actually extends this enum, they will not break anything, and it also has to make sense that they can actually extend it, and they can also extend your functionality. So let's just look at some simple code here to get this point across. So as you can see, we created a simple enum here called colors. I set it to extensible true, and then I just added a blue and a red value. Everything is simple. So if I then go back, or I go over to my codegents, I can say, okay, I want to do something with my enums, and if it's blue, I'll message blue, and if it's red, I'll message red. Everything's fine. I mean, what could go wrong here? Well, the problem is that, as you saw over here, we made this extensible true. By making extensible true, then someone could actually add a new color. They're going to add green, or they can add whatever color they wanted. So let's just make a little change to our enum and add in an event. By adding in an event, we will say, okay, if it's blue to this, if it's red to this, and if it's not one of the colors that we already know about, we have the ability here to do something on the event. This of course means that when someone adds a new enum value, they also have to subscribe to this event and do something based on this new event. And this of course is better than the other way, and it's also an okay way of doing things. It's an easy way. But let's just challenge this a little bit more, and let's introduce some interfaces. So the first thing is we have to create, of course, is some this is the interface itself, and this is a simple interface. Of course, you should make it more based on what you need, but I just added a get color and an update item description. If we then look, we create some codegents that implements this interface. They're very simple. Get color exists this, and then it just updates the item description. And then, of course, as a last thing, we have to implement something. What if someone chooses something that is not within our implementation? What should happen? And here I just added a simple error message. Now the good thing about using interfaces is, of course, you start making a very strict contract. That means that anyone who wants to extend our enum should also implement this interface. So if we go over to our enums, you can see what we did. We set a default implementation to blue. So if for some reason someone created something that does not have an implementation, it will always run the blue. And then if you choose something that is not within our enum, this could be that either someone extends it and then they remove it, and for some reason they did not clean up after themselves. If we use the no color implementation, which we saw earlier. And besides that, of course, we just use these implementation of iColor and then the version of the code unit that you want to run. So if you start doing this, you will make a strict contract, making sure that anyone that actually starts implementing our enum, they also do it in the way that we intend. Of course, it's always possible to break this, but it should be a good guideline for all the developers to actually have somewhere to look, to have a guideline of what we want. The second thing that we're going to look at is about keeping our code local or global, or what we want. So let's say we have this simple code unit here. It's a car, and the car has 3 functions or 3 procedures. Open door, turn on engine, and press speeder. Everything's fine. This should work like you would expect. But however, what happens if someone extends our code and starts calling these in a different way? What if they, for example, call press speeder before they call open door? Well, it might not do anything wrong, but it might also be a problem for us because we might have expected open door to be the first one to be called. So there are 2 ways of fixing this. The first way is, of course, in code you can make sure that one of them has already been called, so set up some preconditions making sure that, for example, you cannot turn on the engine before you have opened the door. So you make some code that checks that the precondition of the open door has been run. However, that's a very complicated way, and it gets very daunting at times. The second way is that we actually make all our functions local, and then we have one global function. With this global function, you ensure that if someone calls our code, they can only call this one, and it would call everything in the right order that we want it to be called. Now, this of course also limits what people can actually do here, because you can pretty much not do anything other than just call drive car. You can't change anything. So again, like with the enums, we should start adding some events. Now, this is a simple way of adding events. We always do on before and on after on each of our functions. And this would be very great for many developers because it means they can actually hook into our functions at any time. However, there is a problem here, because by hooking in, or by creating these events, you're also making a contract towards anyone that wants to extend our extension, saying that these events are always going to be here and we're not going to change them. Now, of course, you can obsolete them and you can do something, and you can always, if it's an integration event, you are not making a contract as such, but to reality you are, because if you keep on changing these events, people are going to get tired and they're not going to want to use your extension going forward. On top of that, you also have to make sure that when you make an event, that all the parameters that are needed are passed to this event. Because, for example, here now, of course, this is a stupid example, but this one doesn't really do anything. So if I did something on open door, maybe this has some parameters that I should send into the event, so to have the ability to actually change something that is returned back and the code can execute. You have to make the events, but you have to also think about what events are actually needed. Not just like this, where you just put everything on before and after. Because, as I said, it might look very good when you look at it, but it's not really the right solution. The second thing we're going to look at is if you implement the isHandled. Now, this isHandled is pretty simple, because all it does is that you pass in a parameter isHandled to the subscriber, and if someone sets this isHandled on our event, that means that they're saying, okay, I've made so many changes to this code that I just want to do my thing and exit out of your code. This is a good pattern to do. However, you also have to make sure that if you do this, you're also saying, okay, someone is allowed to change this code totally out of my control, and of course, if anything breaks, it's no longer your responsibility, because someone has set isHandled, so it's their responsibility to make everything work. But again, make sure that if you do isHandled, it might not be that you want to exit here. This might be an if statement calling, okay, on before door you do some code, blah blah blah, and then you can always say, if it's handled, run this code. If not handled, don't run this code, and then you can still run some code afterwards. The isHandled is a powerful pattern, but you have to be careful when you use it. So that was all the code I was going to show. So let's just go back to the final thoughts. So as you can see, by doing small things into our workflow and then making these part of our daily routine, you can actually make our code more stable, and you can make it easier for someone to call it. Now, as I also mentioned earlier, of course, we cannot make our code 100% unbreakable. And anyone who wants to break it can break it. But most developers don't want to break our code. Most developers just want to extend it in a meaningful way. So what we can do is make it easier for them to do so. So just one afterthought is, always remember when you're writing your code to think about, what if I want to extend this? A good practice is actually you can create your own dummy extension that extends your main extension and see if you can actually do some changes without breaking something else. Now I know this is going to be always case from case where you have to think about if it's worth using the time spent on this. But I implore you to always think about, not always this thought that many people have, if the customer wants to pay for it. Because by making our code more stable, the customer in the long run is also going to be more happy. And the developers are going to be more happy. Everyone is just going to be easier. You have always had these extensions or code that you're always saying, oh no, I don't want to work on this code because I know that it's so difficult to maintain because everyone has just done all these workarounds everywhere and I'm afraid that I'll break anything. Well, that was it for this video. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and goodbye.